What's up, friends? Welcome to the 2.6 podcast with Luke and Adrian. On this podcast, we focus on Web3, business, and achieving your personal potential. Today's episode is a Web3 project spotlight, where we'll go deep into some of the details of one of our favorite projects, Chikn, which sits on the Avalanche blockchain. As with all of our episodes, none of what you hear today is to be considered financial advice. This is purely for entertainment purposes. With that all said, let's talk Chikn. Welcome to the 2.6 podcast with Luke and Adrian. Today's episode is part 2 in our Web3 Project Spotlight series focused on the Chikn project, which is on the Avalanche blockchain. In today's episode, we're going to get into more detail on farmland and how it works beyond how you can produce worm with your farmland. If today's your first time listening to the podcast and you'd like a little background on Chikn as a whole, we highly recommend you check one of our previous episodes titled Intro to Chikn, where we start with some of the basics on how the project works and how some of the main elements of that come together to create the overall ecosystem within Chikn. But just as a brief recap on what we know so far, we know there are 3 main NFTs that are part of this ecosystem. There's the Chikn. The Chikn will produce egg. There is the rooster. The rooster will squirt fert. And there's the farmland, which will produce worm, as well as lots of other things that we're going to get into today. So with that said, let's get started in talking a little bit about farmland as a whole. And before we do that, Adrian, just would love to hear from you. How many farms do you have nowadays? I think there's a lot of different kind of strategies that people have. Like you're, as folks have probably heard, your name is Realtor Adrian, so your strategy with farm has a whole lot to do with creating an empire of that. Would love to hear a little about your farms.
So I have a total of 27 farmlands, 19 which are infinites, and we'll go a little bit more in depth about the size of the farmlands. But truly, there's only 5,000 farmland, so I always felt it to be a little bit necessary to accumulate some farmland, right? Which is kind of like digital real estate in my book. So there you go.
Awesome. Yep. So I have a little bit of a smaller farm than Adrian does. I have 6, and am currently working on growing that over time. So we'll talk more about our farms and some of the future things there. But there's a lot of different approaches that we can have there. So all right, so let's talk about farms. So one of the things that you can do with the farm is to grow it. And so one of the things you might wonder is, what's the difference between a small farm and a big farm? Why would I want a larger farm compared to others? So we're going to talk a little. We talked last time about the way that you can deposit a liquidity pool into your farm, and you can use that to earn worm. Well, what happens is when you have a smaller farm, you have to claim that worm every day. So it can't fit all these worm that it's producing. So it'll just stop producing worm when it gets to a certain amount. Well, the larger your farm is, the more worm that you can hold before you have to harvest it. So there, you can get to a certain level when you get to 120 bigness, where it'll actually allow you to you can harvest worm whenever you want. You can wait a month, a year, and you can harvest that worm whenever the time is. There's reasons that you'd want to harvest it before that, but you could wait longer if you wanted to. So that's one of the big things that it allows you to do. Another thing that we'll talk about in a little more detail is that as the farm grows, there are more tiles that show up on the farm, and having more tiles allows you to do a little better job of foraging. There's more things that your chickens and roosters are able to collect when they're there. So it really helps you out in that sense. Another thing that growing your farm does, and we're going to talk more about the worm farm element, which is kind of a whole other part of the farm. But the bigger your farm is, the deeper that your worms can dig, and that gives you some benefits within the farm as well. So lots of good things that can happen when you have a big farm. And again, you can have more than one farm too, and that's another part of what we do there. So let's talk about, how do you do it? So what's the best way to make your farm bigger? Well, you do that by burning egg. So depending on the size of your farm, it will cost a different amount of egg to do that. So when your farm is brand new, it takes very little to add another tile to your farm. As your farm gets larger, then it costs more in egg to do that. And it's pretty much balanced with the size of the farm itself that you do that. So that's one of the things you do, is you burn that egg. It lets you upgrade the size of your farm. And you can do that up to 3 times per 24-hour period. So if your farm started off as a 1 bigness, you could burn egg to take it to 2, 3, and 4. And then once you hit that 4th level, then you have to wait another 24 hours before you can do it again. So it allows you to do that 3 times, but not beyond the 3 per 24-hour period. And so those are some of the main things for how you do it. Want to talk a little bit more about the tile element of it. So if you've looked at the farmlands themselves, you'll actually see there's different things that are on it. And so each of those will indicate what resources you'll be able to get. And Adrian's going to talk just in here in a bit about how foraging works and what those resources are. But just know for now that the more tiles you have, the different things that are on there, the more resources you're able to get. And then depending on the rarity of it, so there's for certain resources, there are different things. So, like for example, for a resource that Adrian will talk about called a Vaxium, you can have one that's called a big red windmill that gives you a certain percentage of getting a Vaxium when you forage on there, or you could have an Vaxium pyramid, which has a higher chance of getting it. So there's benefits to having those, and it kind of just makes your farm more valuable to you, but also if you were to look to buy one, some of those that have more resources cost a little bit more than others. And there's also a thing called a blank tile. So usually you'll see those as having grass on them. And what that'll allow you to do is it doesn't have a resource on it. But one of the cool things about it is that as you acquire resources, either by crafting them yourself or by buying them on the marketplace, you can actually place them on that tile. And then your chickens and roosters will be able to access those things from that. So that's just kind of the high level of how the farmland growth works, how the tiles work, and as we talked about, there's lots of reasons you want to have those more tiles. And Adrian, I want to turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about what do you do with those? How does foraging work?
Yeah, so foraging, what is foraging, you might wonder. So foraging is basically a way of gathering resources from your farm, and those resources are used to craft certain items. So resources that are basically included inside your farmland, there's 10 of them, and we'll go through that list. The first on the list is a Vaxium, kind of like what Luke was talking about. Dark matter, gold, liquidium, lumber, mana, mech, stone, tungsten, and veg. So those are the 10 items. So what do you do and why would you want to forage for those items? So anything that you craft or make in chicken, you're going to need resources. So the benefit of that forage is going to allow you to craft items from the resources that you're used. So how do you forage? You basically send out any combination of chickens or roosters. And that's going to be somewhat kind of dependent on how big your farmland is. So if you just have one tile, you're only going to send out one bird. If you have an infinite farmland, which is basically 24 tiles, you're able to send out 24 birds. And that could be in any combination that you'd like. So you could send out 24 chickens. If you have 24 chickens, you could send out 24 roosters or any combination. So depending on how many birds you send out at one time to forage, it's going to cost egg for any chicken that you send out, and it's going to cost fert for any rooster that you send out. So when you send out those birds, you're gonna collect resources, and we'll go further into, how much time it's going to take for your birds to go out and bring back resources. That's going to be dependent on how much worm you have in your worm farm, but we'll get into that a little bit further down the line. So when your birds come back and bring back their resources, you're able to craft certain items. Now, sometimes you're going to find that the game is going to require some more resources than others. A lot of it's going to be dependent on which items you're crafting. So, crafting is basically you're going to take the resources, you need a blueprint in order to craft any type of farmland or bird equips. So, equips are, in a nutshell, are going to be items that you're going to use and equip to your farmland. And then you also have other equips that you can equip to your birds. So what exactly are equips? Equips are going to be used on farmland blank tiles. So that might be certain equips that you can use to produce more resources. If you want to maybe resources that you're lacking in that you don't have, and you have a blank space, you can actually put one of those equips to produce a certain resource. Sometimes people will want a huge general resource collecting farmland where you can collect every resource that you'd like, or you can definitely specialize and basically focus more on one resource at a time. So what exactly are equips? So equips are going to be used on your farmland either on a blank tile to allow you to forage for resources that your farm doesn't already have, or maybe something that you want more of. And then, of course, there's also equips for your birds, your chicken or your roosters, to make them better at foraging for a certain resource. They can definitely help out with making your farmland also more efficient. We'll get a little bit more into that. Those are called SIPs. We'll get into that later on. And then there's also future uses in other parts of the game that will be rolled out in the future. So let's talk a little bit about how all these work. Luke, do you have any examples of how you kind of structure your farmland with certain equips?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I have a few farms. So some of them are smaller than others. So I have one that's kind of my golden child farm. It's called Skywalker Ranch, kind of a playoff of Skywalker and Bok Bok as a chicken. So that one's actually a really good one. I have some really good resources on there, and so I have a few legendary tiles on it. It's a great one. So that one I don't really have to do a whole lot to make it better. I do have some equips that I put onto the farm to really make it stronger than it could have otherwise been. And then I have another one that's not as good. It has a lot of kind of normal like plain tiles on it. I have a whole lot of equips on that one because it has a lot of blank tiles. So I kind of spread them out differently. But there's pros and cons, I think, to both ways of having it. So one is that really good one has great resources on it and they'll never go away. The other one I can kind of customize to have whatever my good farm doesn't have. So I mainly do my foraging between those two farms as I start to build up my other four to get a little bit larger. But how about you, Adrian? How do you do yours?
So I think my first infinite farm that I have is more of a general farm, so I can produce just about any resource on it. And then I have my specialty farm. So if I have a farm that can produce, say, tungsten or a vaxium, I'll kind of just lean more towards to having certain farms that I could send a big flock of birds to go farm and just get the one resource that I'm short on. But I generally like to have a general farm in general that I can produce, of course, majority of the resources. And then I also like to have like specialized farmlands to where if I'm short on a resource, I can quickly get a lot more of those resources that I'm needing to craft items.
Yep. And one of the things I don't think we got into too much is that the birds actually have the ability to have stronger foraging abilities for certain resources. So, like some are better at foraging for dark matter, some are better at foraging for different things. So, one of the things that's kind of nice, you don't have to remember all of that, is you can actually group your birds into flocks so that you have I have 12 birds that go on to one of my farms, 12 birds that go onto the other farm. And that allows me to make sure that I'm getting kind of the best of those. And so, especially I would say my setup is maybe small to medium size compared to some other folks. For those folks that have even larger farms with 50, 100 birds and a bunch of different farmlands, being able to do that, I think makes it a ton easier for them.
Yeah, 100%.
So,
So going
so
into like the
awesome.
worm farm. So the worm farm is basically the way to kind of visualize is it's beneath your farm. So this worm farm is where you would deposit the worm that you receive from, say, your LP, or maybe you're buying it on the open market, or just receiving it from some other type of collaboration. So what do you exactly do with your worm farm? So mainly what you're going to be doing is you're going to be deploying worm underneath your worm farm. You're going to be burning egg to open up those tiles in your worm farm, and then deploying worm to get, say, blueprints or treasure chests that are holding resources within those certain tiles that are revealed. And so when you're deploying those worms, you're able to it's also there to kind of help you become more efficient in foraging and reducing the foraging time. So if the more worm you have in your farmland, the faster the foraging time is when you're sending out your birds to forage. The larger your farm is, the deeper you can dig also. And also the further you go into your farmland, or the further down you go into your farmland, the more rare the blueprints become. And there's going to be a lot more things when collaborations that will go more further into as we hear more with other projects and whatnot, and what you can basically find in your farmland. So it's always good to dig into your farmland and deploy those worms. So I would say right now my goal in my farmland or my worm farm is to get all the way down to the last tile. Now, I'm not quite there on my farmland right now, but the more you dig into it by burning egg, the more blueprints that you're going to get. So last week I had 3 blueprints that I noticed that I had in my worm farm. And of course I have to burn or deposit more worm into my worm farm so I can get to those blueprints. Now, those blueprints, of course, are used a lot more in crafting items. So I definitely wanted to get to them as soon as possible. So the main goal of this game is patience. I mean, it is going to take some time. It's not something that you can just like jump right into and go crazy on them. I guess you can, but I mean, it's sometimes fun just to kind of be patient and kind of pace out the game, if that makes it clear. So, Luke, how far are you down in one of your worm farm?
Yeah, so not quite as far as you, definitely. So I have first of all, my farm's not quite as large. So my biggest one is 122 bigness. So I'm only able to get to a certain depth. I think it'll go to 25. But I'm actually not quite that far either. I think about 15 in mine. And one of the things that's kind of cool about the game is there's a ton of different strategies that you can have. It's not just kind of
Yeah.
one strategy that everyone runs to. So as Adrian kind of talked to you, there's a great strategy in foraging, digging into your farm, getting blueprints, that kind of thing. There's other ones that you can focus on other things. Some people focus on making their birds larger. Some people focus on banking liquidity pool and trying to grow more worm. So there's a lot of different things. I probably focus a little bit more on my roosters. My roosters are getting pretty big. So I usually focus a little bit more on that, as well as making my farmlands more big and then growing my liquidity pool. So my worm farm isn't quite as deep as a lot of others in the game, but there's just kind of a lot of different ways to kind of go about it.
And I think to piggyback a little bit on that, Luke, is sometimes you can just go onto the open market and buy these blueprints. You can't necessarily
Mhm.
buy resources because resources are off chain, meaning that they're kind of built into the background of the game. So, but with blueprints, and say with your foraging, and you don't have the blueprint that you want, you can go and buy those equips for the farmland or even for the birds, and you can buy them on the open market. Because when you start creating items, you can keep those items and equip them onto your farmlands, onto your birds, or there's an element in the game to where you can actually craft an NFT for those items and sell it onto the open market. So just keep in mind, if you don't produce it, you can always usually buy it. So it's always fun to look at on the open marketplace to see if there's any good deals on the items or blueprints that you may not have.
Yeah, and that's actually a great segue. So in our next episode, we're actually going to go deep into the marketplace and like how that all works. So really looking forward to sharing that with
Yeah.
y'all in our next episode. Just to kind of recap some of the main things from today. One of the big ones is that farmland does a lot of different things. So we can earn worm from it. We can use it to forage for resources. We can use those resources to craft, and then we can also acquire the blueprints that we need by digging into our worm farm. So that's gonna cover us for today. Just to kind of close us out, Adrian, can you tell them where they can find you on socials?
Yeah, I think the best way to find me is on X at Realtor Adrian. That's the best place to find me for sure. Luke.
Awesome. And you can find me at Luke152. Thank y'all so much for listening. As always, please rate, review, and subscribe if you found today's session valuable, and share it with a friend. If you know somebody that might benefit from learning a little bit more about chicken, please invite them to join and stay tuned because we have a whole lot more to come for you. But with that, friends, we will talk with y'all again soon, and check out the show notes for some links to some great things about chicken. Thanks so much, everyone.
Absolutely. Bok bok.